Well, a very warm welcome to everyone to this 25th Consumer Pyramids Research Webinar. We're happy to announce that we have completed 24, and this is the 25th one. We began a little over a year ago, and these webinars have been a great place to showcase the work of researchers who put to use CMI's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey data. Today, we have an excellent paper, one of those very few ones, which dwell upon the problem of the lockdown, the COVID-induced lockdown, and its impact upon food security, on the availability of the share of food expenditure in households. We have Nidhi, Kaicker, Aashi, Gupta, who will present this work of theirs. And Raghav Gaya is not here, but he was one of the authors of this paper as well. And after the presentation, we will have Dr. Chandana Maitra, who will discuss the paper. So I will leave all the discussions to the authors and the discussant. All I will say is that the authors have approximately an hour to make their presentation. And the audience can, during that presentation, type in their questions in the Q&A box. And the authors will answer that whenever they find the time to do so. And if they can't answer all the questions or find it fit, they will answer the questions at the end of the session. All questions and answers, unless somebody explicitly says so, will be available on the CMI's Consumer Pyramids DX website after a day or so. And this whole session is being recorded, is live streamed on YouTube, and the YouTube link will be available on the CPDX website as well. And that's been the way we conduct this. All the past 24 research webinars are available as YouTube links on the Consumer Pyramids DX website, and so will this one be. Feel free to ask questions during the session. The authors will answer them at their convenience, and all the Q&As will be available later on for all of us to learn from. This webinar, like all others, are designed to give valuable feedback to the authors, to understand what their work is, and to help them hone their work or to set the agenda for future research. So that's what this is. Let me give you a very brief introduction to the authors. So we have with us Dr. Nidhi Kaicker. She holds a PhD degree in management and an MBA from the Faculty of Management Studies, University of Delhi. She works essentially on food security at the household level. That's very interesting. She works at the household level, so deep record level data. She has been working on this problem for the last 1 decade or more. And she has traditionally worked using the NSO's databases. And now that the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey data is available over the last 1 year, she has been an avid user of the CPHS database. And she's showcasing her work on this webinar today. With her is her co-author, Aashi Gupta. She is a doctoral student at the Delhi School of Economics. Her interests are in gender economics and multi-generational persistence of poverty. Authors, if I make any mistake somewhere, please correct me. I'm trying my best to do justice to the work that you people do. And later on, we will have Dr. Chandana Maitra, who will be discussing the paper. She is a lecturer at University of Sydney and works at the confluence of development economics and health and poverty. So with that brief little introduction, I will hand over back to Preetha and to the authors to start off the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mahesh and Preetha. I hope my screen is visible.
It is.
Okay. So thank you for inviting us to the CPHS research webinar to present our work. And we express our appreciation for the team who organizes these webinars. And as has been the case in the previous editions of these webinars, we are really looking forward to getting some critical feedback from the larger research community, and especially from Chandana, who has kindly agreed to be the discussant of our paper. And I also want to express my appreciation and gratitude to Rajiv of CMI CPHS, who's our relationship manager at the university. And he and Preetha have been extremely helpful and patient with us in our last 1 year of research. And whenever we had any queries, they were very prompt to answer. So I think this is a good forum for us to thank them as well. Okay, so moving on. What we're going to present today is a paper titled COVID-19 Pandemic and Food Security in India. Can authorities alleviate the disproportionate burden on the disadvantaged? This was published in Journal of Policy Modeling a few months ago. And meanwhile, our team comprising Raghav Geha, Aashi, Gupta, and I have worked on an extension of this paper. So while the published version looks at covariates of food expenditure shares and the impact of COVID-19 induced shocks among households in India using the nationally representative CMI CPHS, the second study looks at the composition of food, or in other words, dietary diversity of the household food consumption basket. So the pandemic impacted a household's ability to not just access enough food, but also a diverse range of foods varying in nutrition, which is why we felt that the second study is complementary to the first. And therefore, while our focus is on our main paper, we would present some findings from our second study as well. And mainly focusing on the role played by income shocks mediated by household socioeconomic characteristics, pandemic indicators, and food prices in explaining variations in two very important indicators of food security. One is the food expenditure share, and the second is the dietary diversity index. And Aashi and I will be jointly delivering this presentation today. So before we formally introduce the research objectives, I want to take our audience through three graphs. So the first graph that you see on the slide shows the share of food in total expenditure in rural and urban India for the period January 2019 to August 2021. And so if you can see, we see a sharp increase in food expenditure shares during April 2020, which coincides with the period of the nationwide lockdown. And just that, so, since we may have, varied audience, just to be on the same page, the first COVID-19 case was detected in India in January 2020, and the first death was recorded in the second week of March 2020. Soon after, the number of cases started rising, and the state responded by imposing restrictions, banning travel, and announcing a complete nationwide lockdown in the third week of March 2020. So if you look at the rural and the urban graphs, the share of food in total expenditure in rural areas, it ranged from 45 to 50% in the 16 months prior to the announcement of the lockdown. And for urban areas, it ranged between 40 to 45%. And this suddenly shot up to 59% in urban areas and 61% in rural. Of course, the total expenditure may have shrunk, firstly, because there were lesser avenues for discretionary spending. And at the same time, there was increased uncertainty, which induces people to reduce spending on non-essential items. But what is important is that the nationwide lockdown went into phases, and there was a gradual opening up June 2020 onwards. And then the peaks of the first and the more deadly Delta variant second wave were in October 2020 and somewhere around April and March 2021. So even after the second wave had subsided, the food expenditure shares were not back to the pre-pandemic levels. So it looks like that the movement restrictions at the onset of the pandemic acted more like a temporary shock than a permanent one, which resulted in declining shares of food in total expenditure, but stabilizing at a much higher level than that was observed pre-pandemic. And which is why this stylized character needs further investigation. So now I come to my second graph. The second graph shows the index of dietary diversification for the same period for rural and urban areas. We will discuss how we compute this index, but for now, we just want to share that the higher value of this index implies a more concentrated diet. There are fewer items in the expenditure basket, and a lesser value of this index implies that it's a more diversified diet. The dietary diversification has been an ongoing phenomenon, and some of our previous research using NSO consumption expenditure survey data for the years 93, 94, 2004, 5, and 2011, 12 confirms dietary shifts in India, which is a switch from traditional staples towards food products that include more meats, dairy, fruits and vegetables, and oil, and points towards the important role played by food prices, expenditure, demographic characteristics, and lifestyle changes. If we look at our results from the CPHS over the last 2.5 years, we find that, as expected, urban areas show greater diversity compared to rural areas. That's why the yellow line is lower than the green line, but see a very steep increase at the onset of the pandemic. The increase in the index is almost 10% for rural households and about 7% for urban households relative to the previous month. So while the shifting to a more concentrated diet was more pronounced in rural areas, we see similar phenomenon even in the urban areas. And then we see a sharp reversal once the lockdown restrictions were lifted. And we see a small spurt in index in the rural areas during the second wave. While the reduced dietary diversity may be explained by supply restrictions, forcing households to consume only what is available, but lack of affordability to consume a varied diet cannot be disregarded, which is why we investigate this further. The final graph, which before we formally start with the objectives, is the share of cereals and pulses, which we call staples, in total food expenditure. Again, it's for the same period for rural and urban disaggregated. And we see the general trend is that of declining share of food expenditure on staples. And this is consistent with the extant literature on dietary transition and dietary diversification. But two very important, interesting results that emerge on careful examination. Firstly, while the urban trend has been relatively smooth, the rural trend shows sudden jumps. And especially, these jumps actually coincide with the lockdown, the first wave, and the second wave. Secondly, there's a sharp reduction post the nationwide lockdown and no reversal to the pre-pandemic levels. So these spurts are alarming, especially because they have important nutritional implications. So the three graphs that we saw inform us about the state of some very crucial indicators of food security in India in the last couple of years. Formally, food security has been defined as the state when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. From this broadly accepted definition of the FAO, food security can be seen in 4 dimensions. The first is access, economic access to food, which is largely a function of income generation and food prices. The second is availability, which is a function of robust food supply systems. The third is utilization, which is a function of food composition and nutrient content. And the fourth cross-cutting dimension is the stability of food systems over time to withstand any unfavorable conditions which may place households or individuals or communities at the risk of becoming food insecure. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, it largely began as a health emergency, but soon it translated into a full-blown economic and humanitarian crisis. And the pandemic has affected all the four pillars of food security. But most directly, it impacts access to food, even though the impacts are also felt through disruptions to availability, shifts in consumer demand towards cheaper, less nutritious foods, and food price instability. So, as a result of the mobility restrictions which have been imposed by governments, many people they lost jobs and incomes or closed down businesses. And how these affect consumption actually depends on the nature of the good. So, whether it is essential or whether it is discretionary. So in India, the nationwide lockdowns and the associated economic downturns, and combined with suspension of school nutrition programs, because there were school closures for one of the largest school closures that we saw in India. They may have worsened food security status of several adults and children. And our present study analyzes food demand and composition among households in India prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to now pass on the presentation to my research collaborator, Aashi, who will take us through the research objectives and the intended contribution of the study and explain the data sources. So over to you, Aashi.
Thank you, Nidhi. So I'll first start talking about the existing literature. So it majorly talks about the potential as well as the realized impact of the pandemic on household food security outcomes. An obvious but remarkable observation in a host of studies is that the restrictions on the movement due to the policies to contain the spread of coronavirus have had a severe impact in the form of disrupted value chains, and particularly in informal markets. However, at the same time, the impact on prices depends on the resilience of the value chains. It has also been noted in the literature that despite the success of food supply systems as measured by their capability to adapt to changes such as COVID-19 or provide a variety of food at relatively low prices, the increased household food security can also be explained by loss of income and employment. A host of studies have attempted to assess the impact of the pandemic on food composition as well as nutrient intake. These have suggested a shift away from the more nutritious diet to cheaper and less nutritious food, reduction in dietary diversity scores, and more so for rural households, households with no formal education and low monthly income, as well as the households in areas with high number of COVID-19 infections. It was also found out that there were significantly larger declines for more nutritious food items such as fruits, eggs, fish, and meat as a result of the pandemic. Therefore, the major conclusion that can be drawn from the existing literature points towards the reduced ability of households to access quality diets due to affected production, supply restrictions, and reduced demand due to income, unemployment, price, as well as health shocks that were induced by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Talking about the intended contribution of our study, to our knowledge, this is the first empirical study examining the impact of the pandemic-induced economic stressors and supply shocks on food diversity using a nationally representative data set. The study provides evidence of the potential mechanisms driving food consumption patterns in Indian households, as well as the dietary transition. In the extension of the study, we use an alternate measure of dietary diversity that captures not just the number of different food items in the food consumption basket, as has been used in earlier studies, but it also captures the relative importance of different food items or food groups in total food expenditure. In addition to the household socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that is used in extant literature, we have also used the state-specific COVID-19 infections as an explanatory variable. We also explore the variation in dietary diversity among households belonging to different income groups, castes, and religions to examine the disproportionate burden of the pandemic on food security among the disadvantaged and the minorities. Next slide, please. So our study can broadly be classified into 4 research questions. And through these, we aim to understand the determinants of food consumption patterns in rural and urban Indian households and the impact of an unanticipated shock such as COVID-19 pandemic on the same. These questions are, first, have there been shifts in the food angle curves prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic in India? The study of the relationship between commodity expenditures and incomes, or the angle relationship, or the angle curves, has been the center of applied microeconomic analysis. Studying food angle curves and their shifts will help explain the consumption response of rural and urban households to the unanticipated income, unemployment, price, as well as health shocks. The second research question that we explore is how does the above vary across households with different socioeconomic and demographic characteristics? We believe this is an important domain to understand to help decipher and formulate targeted policies for the most affected groups and to build strong safety nets for the uncertain future. Third, what are the determinants of dietary diversity in India? And do we see observable changes in the last 3 years as a result of the pandemic-induced economic stressors and supply restrictions? This again is an important indicator of what the households are consuming. Studying dietary diversity becomes important as we understand the role of a balanced diet in maintaining good health. And lastly, what is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic induced income shock to the households on the composition of food consumed by households? So to briefly go over the research objectives and the methodologies used to achieve the same in our study. First, we examine the shift in food angle curves between the period prior to COVID-19 pandemic and during the nationwide lockdowns and once the deadly second wave had subsided. Second, we estimate the demand function for food, for which we use 2-stage least squares panel regression model with food expenditure shares as a dependent variable, regressed on incomes, prices, and a vector of household characteristics and pandemic-mediated indicators. We'll be explaining this in detail in the later slides. We also estimate the determinants of dietary diversity, again using 2-stage least squares panel regression models with index of dietary diversity as a dependent variable. The calculation of this index is again explained in detail in the later slides. In addition, we examine the response of households to income shocks as a result of COVID-19 pandemic using a difference in differences technique to see the differential impact of the pandemic-induced income shock on affected versus the unaffected or the less affected households. So talking about the data, we have used 8 waves of data from Consumer Pyramids Household Survey conducted by Center of Monitoring Indian Economy. These 8 waves are from the 16th wave for the period of January to April 2019 to the 23rd wave for the period of May to August 2021. So majorly we have tried to cover a year before the pandemic, as well as the 2020, the deadly 2020 year, as well as the second wave in 2021. Pooling the cross-sectional data from these 8 waves helps us assess the factors influencing food expenditure shares over time, especially before and during the COVID-19 pandemic in India. We are all aware of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, which is a continuous survey administered on a panel of sample households. It delivers fast or high-frequency data on consumption expenditure of households collected thrice every year. So we obtain the monthly household consumption and household income data from the consumption and income pyramids of the CPHS from January 2019 to August 2021. These are based on 4-month recall period. So there are close to 1.5 million households every month in the data set, although the figure dropped below 1 million during January 20 to May 20, mostly due to the lockdown. However, we believe the CPHS adjusted weights account for the loss of data during this period. The information on the socio-demographics of the households has been obtained from the People of India and the Aspirational India domains of the CPHS for the same time period. These are collected on a wave basis, that is every 4 months. So the household per capita expenditures have been deflated using the monthly CPI data provided by RBI for the rural and urban India, which is at state level. And the major reason for deflating expenditures was to adjust for any part of change in total expenditure that is attributable to the price movements to arrive at a real or inflation adjusted indicator. In addition, we have used in our demand specification relative price ratios of vegetables to cereals and pulses, sugar to cereals and pulses, milk to cereals and pulses, and oil to cereals and pulses. So controlling for relative food price changes is important because a change in relative prices of goods has a significant impact on the household's shopping baskets. So we use the monthly retail prices of 19 essential commodities at the state level, and the data for the same has been extracted from the Department of Consumer Affairs. The geometric means of these commodities are used to get average food prices for the following food groups, which are cereals, pulses, vegetables, sugar, oil, and milk. These are then converted to 4 non-staples to staples food ratios, with vegetables, sugar, oil, and milk in the numerator, one at a time, and the weighted average price of cereals and pulses in the denominator. We also include in our demand specification the cumulative COVID-19 cases at the state level at the end of every month. So the data is collected from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, India, with familiar caveats of underestimation. I now hand over to Nidhi to talk about the methodology and the econometric models in detail.
Okay, thank you, Aashi. So I'll first discuss the model specification for the demand function of food. So we use a multiple regression model with the specification that you see on the slide. And here the share of food in total expenditure, FES, is estimated by a set of explanatory variables such as household characteristics, food prices, and progression of the COVID-19 pandemic in the state. So FES is the food share in total expenditure of the ith household at time period T, where time period is from 1 to 32, since this is monthly data from January 2019 to August 2021. X is the vector of household socioeconomic and demographic variables, and this includes the lagged household expenditure per capita and its square, the age and gender of household head, the household size, household caste and religion, the household composition, education, and occupation groups. Z refers to the vector of state-specific variables, so jth state going from 1 to 28, And namely, these are the food price ratios, which Aashi just described, and the progression of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been measured by using the number of cumulative cases at the end of each month in a state. In addition, we use the lag of dependent variable and the time dummy variables to examine changes in food expenditure shares over time. And given that COVID-19 cases may be endogenous, we instrumented using a two-stage least squares estimation. So in the first stage, we estimate COVID-19 cases by two instruments. These are the length of the pandemic and the length of the transmission of the pandemic, and the distance between the city that first reported a COVID case in a particular state and where it was first recorded, that is in Thrissur, Kerala. So the second specification that we are using is very similar to the first one. Here our dependent variable is the index of dietary diversification. So I think it's time that we define what it is, since we've been saying that we will define it subsequently. So a commonly used measure of household dietary diversity is counting the number of food or food groups that is consumed by a household. Though a very useful approach, this does not allow for the relative importance of different food items or groups in total food expenditure. So hence we follow another approach which relies on shares of different food groups in the food expenditure basket. So an index of dietary diversification is calculated as the sum of squares of the shares of various food commodities in the food consumption basket of the household. And this is similar to the Simpson's index, which is widely used in ecological literature to measure species diversity or biodiversity, and in many cases crop diversity. In fact, even the Herfindahl-Hirschman index used in microeconomics to measure the competitiveness of an industry is similarly calculated. So we use 8 food groups to construct the IID, that is Index of Dietary Diversification. These are staples, which is cereals and pulses. Second is vegetables. Then third is fruits. Fourth is all milk and milk products. Fifth is oil. Sixth is all meats and eggs, so meat, fish, eggs. Seventh is sugar. And the last one is all other items, which includes packaged processed foods and anything that has not been included in the 7 food groups. X is the same household characteristics that we use in a previous specification. Z is the state level reported COVID-19 cases and food price ratios. While in the previous specification, we used MPC and its square, the log of MPC and its square. Here we experiment with using expenditure quintiles. Another variable that we introduce in this specification is the expenditure on transportation by each household. Because COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant lockdown was characterized by mobility restrictions, and there were several behavioral changes like more time being spent at home, lesser eating out, greater dependence on food deliveries, also dependence on packaged and ready to eat and cook meals. So to capture this behavioral change, we introduced this variable. And as in the previous case, we are using lags of the dependent variable and time dummies. And we are also instrumenting COVID-19 cases using a 2SLS estimation. Our choice of explanatory variables and instruments is guided by the extant literature. So I'll first talk about the instruments. The first instrument is the length of the transmission of the pandemic. This is calculated as the number of days between the first reported COVID case in a particular state and the first reported COVID case in the country, that is in Thrissur, Kerala. The second instrument is the distance between the city that reported the first COVID case in a state and between Thrissur. And in the second stage, we use the estimate of the COVID cases from the first stage as an explanatory variable. Now, since the coronavirus infection was contagious in nature, maintaining distance from the infected was the sole protection against it. And hence, therefore it's plausible to argue that longer the distance And larger the time of transmission, the lower will be the intensity of the pandemic. Since the fear of the coronavirus intensified only after the infection started spreading, because the first infection was recorded in January, but the lockdown was announced almost 2 months later. We feel that the relationship between our instruments and the dependent variables is far from direct. And while these instruments directly influence COVID-19 cases in a state, they affect food expenditure shares and index of dietary diversity only indirectly. So our instruments are not just strong instruments, but they also satisfy the exclusion restriction. Then we include in our demand specification the natural log of monthly expenditure per capita as the leading term, and an additional higher order, which is the square. The study of commodity expenditure and income, which is popularly known as the Engel curve, has been the center of applied microeconomic analysis. And further, a quadratic log model, which we are using, permits goods to be luxuries at some levels and necessities at other income levels. We include in our demand specification several household characteristics as described previously, and the list is available on the slide. So we use age of the head of the household and gender of the head of the household, and the household size, which is number of members in a household. The literature on household welfare advocates important role played by size and composition of household in explaining various aspects of well-being, such as food expenditure and income and consumption poverty. There is empirical evidence that food expenditure share increases with household size, number of adults, and age of household head. Female-headed households are found to be more food secure than male-headed households. Food security rises with education of household head. And there's also empirical evidence that households with children are relatively more food insecure on an average. So we use the standard CPHS classification on composition, whether the household is dominated by children or grown-ups or balanced, and also on education, whether the household comprises mostly illiterates, matriculates, or graduates. On occupation group, we use a different classification. We don't use that much of detail that is there in CPHS. We use a binary variable, whether the household's primary occupation is farming or not. And this is an important determinant because the former are likely to have higher calorie requirements based on vigorous physical activities, as well as have greater availability of food from home production. Finally, because religion and religious beliefs play a very important role in food consumption patterns, we use household religion as well as caste, because caste-based inequality in India exists not only in terms of income and wealth, but also food consumption patterns. So these are the household characteristics that we use as our controls. In addition, we are using relative food price ratios, and which have been described. How we compute these has been described by Aashi. And we also use pandemic containment measures, a proxy for pandemic containment measures in our specification, so that we can see the impact of a pandemic mediated variable on food security outcomes. So we use the cumulative COVID-19 cases at the end of each month at the state level. To further examine whether income shocks induced by the COVID-19 pandemic altered the household consumption behavior, we employ a DID, a difference in differences technique. And in our case, the DID compares changes in dietary diversity before and during the pandemic in India for households that did and did not face a severe income shock. So those who did not is the control group, and those who did is the treated group. To measure the income shock, we use monthly total income data for the households for the year April 19 to March 20, that is 1 year before the pandemic, and April 20 to March 21. And it's actually coinciding with the financial year, but we use these months because April 2020 is when the lockdown essentially was there, and therefore we choose April to March instead of the calendar year. So we calculate the change in the income of the households during these months prior to the relative to the previous year. And then we use 6 specifications in our model. So we experiment with different thresholds. So we look at 10% decline, 20%, 25, 30, 35, and 40. So we run our model by classifying households into affected and non-affected groups using these different thresholds. So we have more than 150,000 households in our sample. And based on these thresholds, we find that the affected households range from about 20% when the highest threshold is used and 53% when the lowest threshold is used. So when we use a 10% threshold, 53% households are actually categorized into affected households. The DID assesses the impact of income shocks, which is induced by the nationwide lockdowns to contain the spread of COVID-19 infections on composition of diets. And to fulfill the assumption of parallel trends, we include 2 time periods before the announcement, that is 2018 and 2019, and a year after the announcement of the lockdown. So this is the DID specification. Why gamma is the DID estimator for the dependent variable IDD. IS is the income shock indicator, which takes the value 1 for those households who receive the income shock. And this captures the difference in outcome between intervention and control groups at the baseline. T1, T2, and T3 are the time indicators. The baseline is April 2018 to March 2019. T1 is for the 12 months ending March 2020. T2 is for the 12 months ending March 2021. And T3 is for the 5 months from April to August 2021. The interaction terms DID 1, 2, and 3, they capture the slope changes in outcome between the baseline and the respective time periods. And DID 1 is actually a test of parallel trend assumption. Now, while T2 captures the slope change between baseline and the pandemic year, DID 2 captures the departure of this slope for the intervention group. And the statistical difference between DID 1 and DID 2 is captures the changes in the outcome, that is index of dietary diversity, that can be attributable to the announcement of the nationwide lockdown. And similarly, the statistical difference between DID 1 and DID 3 captures the changes in outcome that can be attributable to the restrictions and the massive spread of infections during the second wave. Z is the same household characteristics that we use in our 2SLS model. So coming to the results, we've plotted the food expenditure shares on the log of total expenditure per capita of households for pre-pandemic, that is Jan 2020, which is the blue line, August 2021, which is the green line, and April 2020, which is the first nationwide lockdown, that is the red line. And this we've done using a LOS, the locally weighted scatter plot smoothing. So we see an upward shift of the LOS, or angle curve in this case, between January 2020 and April 2020 in rural areas. But the gap of the shift was slightly narrower at the lower expenditure levels and wider for the higher expenditure levels. Now, this may be partly attributed to the substitution of expenditure on food sourced from outside with expenditure on home-cooked food by the rich, as the fear of infections rose. There's a downward shift that we see in the angle curves between April 2020 and August 21 once the lockdown restrictions were removed. But the shift was again minimum for the poor and greater for the rich. And the curve remained above the pre-pandemic levels even after the more deadly second wave has subsided. In urban areas, we see a similar trend, except that the shift was much greater for the poor compared to the rich. We now discuss the results of the 2-stage least squares regression model, starting with the effects of the instruments and the MPCE. So we have estimated the results separately for rural and urban areas and for the all India pooled sample. We are going to be selective in our comments here, and the detailed results are available in our full paper. So we get a negative and significant coefficient on both the instruments, which is consistent with our hypothesis that longer the distance from Thrissur and larger the time of transmissions, the lower will be the incidence of the pandemic as measured by the number of COVID-19 infections. in both rural and urban areas and at the all India level, we actually find that the cumulative COVID-19 cases in the state are positively associated with household MPC, with the MPCE, and negatively associated with the square, which implies rising intensity of COVID-19 with affluence, but at a decreased rate. We get a negative coefficient on MPCE for rural households and a positive coefficient of the square, which corroborates a U-shaped convex angle curve. So in rural areas, we can say that the household food expenditure shares first decrease as the total expenditure increases, but after a turning point, the relationship becomes positive. However, the value of this threshold is very high. So largely the angle curve is downward sloping. If we look at urban areas, the coefficient of MPC is positive and that of the square is negative, which corroborates an inverted U-shaped concave angle curve. So in urban areas, the household food expenditure shares increase as the total expenditure increases, but at a very low threshold level. So largely, again, the angle curve is downward sloping and decreasing at an increasing rate. Coming to the impact of the food prices. So we have the 4 relative food price ratios. We find that the coefficients on the more expensive sources of calories, sugar, oil, and milk, are positive. So what does that mean? So when the prices of these more expensive sources of calories increase, their demand reduces through lower real income and substitution of cheaper cereals and pulses. And therefore, the food share increases, and food share is largely a manifestation of concentration of staples. For vegetables, we find a negative share implying lower substitution. Coming to the role played by household characteristics, in the interest of time, we're going to restrict our comments to just the second stage results on the association between household characteristics and food expenditure shares. So we find that there is a positive effect between the age of the head of the household and food expenditure shares in both rural and urban areas. The children-dominated households have higher share of expenditure on food on an average relative to the grown-up dominated households who have a higher average food expenditure shares compared to the balanced households. And we know that children need energy, water, and oxygen to support their growth processes, and more diversified diets inclusive of dairy, fruits, and vegetables, given the income constraint. Household size has a negative association, probably due to economies of scale in food consumption expenditures. If you look at education, we find that the food expenditure share is lower for households with majority of matriculates and even lower with majority of graduates. Farming households have lower shares of expenditure in comparison to non-farming households, and households with a female head have food shares that are higher than households with a male head. Coming to the caste-based disparity, the food share is highest for scheduled caste households, followed by OBCs and STs, compared to the unreserved category, implying that lower castes have higher share of food in total expenditures. If we compare the magnitude of these coefficients, we find that the caste-based disparity is much higher in rural areas compared to the urban. Finally, on religion, as compared to Hindus, we find that Muslims have a higher food expenditure share, while Sikhs and Christians have lower food expenditure shares. So just to summarize our findings from the previous slide, while mathematically we get a concave inverted U-shaped angle curve in urban areas and convex U-shaped one in rural areas, but for a large range of expenditure, the curve is downward sloping. However, the curvature differs, and as MPC increases, the food share declines at a much faster rate in rural areas compared to the urban. Now, this difference in spending behavior of households, as well as households' response to shocks, vary largely in rural and urban areas. I mean, there are differences. For example, while urban households depend on purchased food, rural households may depend on relatively cheaper farm food. And this may well explain in part the different shapes of food angle curves in both the sectors, apart from the differences in consumer food preferences. Also, it is not unlikely that the urban households have unmet demands for necessary goods, including food, at low income levels. And as their incomes increase, they spend their additional earnings on food more than proportionately, and this induces a reduction in share in all other expenditures. And once they reach a certain threshold, they tend to spend more than proportionately on other categories of goods and services. Household head age is positively related to food security status of the households. This is in line with the life cycle hypothesis, because as age rises, assets accumulate, and these assets can be liquidated at the time of an income constraint. But in our case, a positive coefficient, though contrary to the existing literature, may reflect overstocking by the old given the mobility restrictions during the pandemic and especially during the lockdowns. A possible explanation for why larger households have lower food expenditure shares because of the negative sign. Firstly, larger households may benefit from economies of scale in cooking food, from buying food, block pricing. Also, as the household size increases, the households may substitute food from outside, such as restaurants and pre-cooked meals, by home-prepared food, causing reduced expenditure. Larger households may also have better storage facilities to eliminate wastages. Coming to education, we find that lower the schooling level, higher is the household spending on food. And if food adds to awareness of safe and healthy diets, which may also be cheaper, this could partly explain lower food expenditure, and there may be spillover effects through social networks. We find that farming households have lower food expenditure shares than non-farming households. Again, this is surprising, but a possible explanation could be that the consumption of self-produced food in such households may not be fully accounted for in the CMI survey, but I think Mahesh or Preetha are in a better position to tell this. So another reason that we can think of is that consumption of less diversified diets by such households, confining their intake of food mostly to what is grown at home. But this widening gap between energy requirements and intake is not sustainable, except only over a short spell. Coming to the gender of the household head, households with female head on an average have food shares which are higher than a household with a male head. And a possible explanation of these results could be that women are more likely to spend a larger share of their incomes on their children and household consumption relative to men who may spend on status consumer goods or alcohol. And these results are important because they highlight the relevance of women empowerment, and households where women have better representation and autonomy to take household decisions are usually better in terms of household food security, as suggested by the prominent gender economists across the world. Finally, both lower caste and religious minorities, they bore the brunt of alarming spurts of higher food expenditure shares. So to summarize, our findings indicate a spurt in food expenditure shares during the lockdowns, with some reversal once the lockdowns were lifted, but not to the pre-pandemic levels. And because food expenditure shares are a crucial measure of the standard of living, these results are alarming, and especially because of the heterogeneity in response based on very critical household characteristics such as education levels, gender of the household head, social and religious groups to which a household belongs. So I'm going to now invite Aashi again to discuss the results of the extension that we have worked on. So I'll request Aashi to be brief in the 2SLS results because they're largely similar, and focus more on the DID results. And over to you, Aashi.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here we'll be presenting the results of the second state structural equation. And as Nidhi mentioned, we'll be brief. So that's why the first stage results are available in the full paper, and we'll share the link. However, we would want to mention here that the sign of the instruments is negative, which aligns with our hypothesis that greater the distance from threshold or higher the days of transmission, less is the incidence of COVID-19. So as we see here, the coefficient of the predicted COVID-19 cases is positive, indicating towards a reduced dietary diversity, because as we saw earlier, a higher value of this index shows reduced dietary diversity. Second, the coefficient of the urban dummy in the all India results is negative, which means that on average, the urban diets are more diversified than rural diets. Third, the dietary diversity increases as we move from the poorest quintile in income distribution to the second quintile. In rural areas, so there's a stark difference in results between rural and urban India here. In rural areas, diets of the households in fourth and fifth quintile are found to be more concentrated. In urban areas, the dietary diversity trend continues until the fourth quintile, and then it starts to become more concentrated. The fourth major result is that we get a positive coefficient of relative price of vegetables, milk, and oil. So as these prices increase, dietary diversity reduces. This is very much in line with the law of demand that states that as the price of a good increases, its demand reduces. Its quantity demand reduces. So the exception is that of sugar in urban sample. Sugar may be hard to substitute, and rising prices of sugar may imply lower intake of sweets and sweeteners, but perhaps greater intake of other food categories, such as carrots, watermelons, bananas, with high sucrose content, resulting in higher dietary diversity here. Fifth, the coefficient of monthly expenditure on transport is negative. So this may imply higher. So basically, this is talking about higher monthly expenditure on transport is associated with higher dietary diversity among the households. Sixth, time dummies have significant negative coefficients in all specifications, implying that life cycle changes have led to dietary diversification. Talking of household socio-demographics, the IDD reduces with household size, implying larger households have more diversified diets. Age of the head of the household has a very small positive coefficient. The children-dominated households have a lower IDD than balanced households, implying greater diversity. Higher value of IDD among graduate majority households, followed by households with majority of matriculates and households with majority of illiterates is also an important result. The farming households have higher IDD than non-farming households, signifying more concentrated diets on average. Households with female head on average have higher diversity in urban areas, but a lower diversity in rural areas as compared to households with a male head. The deprived socioeconomic groups, that are the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe, and the other backward classes, have a lower IDD than the unreserved category. And lastly, the Muslims have a higher dietary diversity on average in both rural and urban India relative to Hindus. And it is also true at all India level. The other minorities, Sikh and Christian, however, have a more concentrated diet as compared to Hindus. So to summarize the key results of this model, index of dietary diversity increased as the cumulative COVID-19 cases at the state level increased. This implies that the households shifted to a more concentrated diet as the pandemic intensified, And this result is well in line with the existing literature that we talked about. And this result is not surprising given the fact that the supply chains were disrupted, supply of many food categories contracted, and the retail prices spiked during the first nationwide lockdown. Second, we see greater concentration of diets among poor and among the very rich. And this is true in both rural and urban areas. So among the poorest, larger share of staples may explain this. Among the richest, substitution of more expensive sources of calories for cheaper sources, but not necessarily greater variety may explain this. Also, concentration of food expenditures on others category, comprising of packaged foods or ready to cook and eat, or the processed cereals such as noodles, breads, etc., may explain the high value of in IDD among the more affluent in both rural and urban areas. Third, a plausible explanation for increased dietary diversity with household size could be consumption of more food categories by all members of the households having varied tastes and preferences put together. The children-dominated households as well as the grown-ups dominated households have higher dietary diversity, which may be explained by the varying energy needs of children, a sharp age divide in food preferences, with younger age groups more attracted to new foods advertised in the media. So dietary diversity reduces with education levels. This is a very surprising result. Education level of households play an important role in shaping preferences, as it is supposed to increase awareness of safe and healthy diets and also widens access to markets through better information availability. An alternative conjecture is that with higher educational attainments, diets could also include fewer but healthier food commodities. Hence, a more detailed scrutiny here is necessary. We also see that households with farming as a primary occupation have more concentrated diets than the households with non-farming occupation. A plausible explanation behind this could be that the former are likely to have higher calorie requirements based on vigorous physical activities. In addition, small farmers tend to produce and consume just a few food commodities. So basically, they are only consuming what they are producing because it's, again, cost effective. Seventh, the gender and age of a household head influence food consumption. We saw this result in the previous model as well. For instance, a female household head may take better decision towards food security of their children and households. Older household heads are likely to have limited food preferences and may be more constrained in their access to food market. Greater dietary diversity among the lower caste confirms that dietary transition is not just a middle income class phenomenon, but far more pervasive. We cannot rule out the possibility that the disadvantaged castes are more likely to substitute cheaper grades of cereals. So diets may be more diversified, but not necessarily healthier. Dietary diversity may differ among different religions in India. This may be because of different religious beliefs and practices. For example, the Islamic religion allows consumption of certain types of meats, which perhaps adds to the greater dietary diversity that we witnessed in the results. Moving on to the results of the DID specification that we employed in our third model. We present the results for rural and urban areas for the lowest threshold, that is 10% income shock, the highest threshold, that is the 40% income shock, and the 25% threshold. The results for the other thresholds are available in the full paper, and we restrict our comments to the coefficients of time dummies and income shock variables based on DID estimators. For the household characteristics, we are not going to go much into detail, but we get similar results of the coefficients as in the 2SLS model, which also confirm the robustness of our results, by the way. So as we see here, the coefficient of T1 is negative in all specifications. This coefficient tells us that the IDD has decreased, or synonymously, the dietary diversity has increased between 2018 and 2019. The coefficient of T2 and T3 are negative, implying that the trend of dietary diversification continued in 2020 and 2021. And if we compare rural and urban coefficients, the magnitude of decrease is larger for rural areas. The coefficient of IS, that is the income shock, captures the difference in IDD between intervention and the control group. The coefficient is majorly positive across thresholds in both rural and urban samples. The affected households, or the households that faced an income shock of varying thresholds, have a higher IDD, or a relatively more concentrated diet, than the unaffected, or as some people would like to call, the less affected households. While the coefficient of T captures the change in slope in the outcome between the baseline and the time period in question for the control group, the coefficient of DID captures the deviation from the slope for the intervention group. The coefficient of T1 is negative and DID1 is positive. So IDD declines between 2018 and 2019. So, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Sorry, I think I lost the signal for a second there. Okay.
So just
so the coefficient of I was talking about the coefficient of T1, which is negative, and DID1 is positive. So IDD declines between 2018 and 2019 for the control group. But for the intervention group, the trend reverses with a small magnitude. Similarly, coefficient of T2 is negative and DID2 is positive. But the magnitude of coefficient is higher than the coefficient of DID2 in urban areas, whereas the coefficient of T2 is lower than that of DID2 in rural areas. Similarly, coefficient of T3 is negative and DID3 is positive. And here, the magnitude of coefficient of T3 is higher than the coefficient of DID2 in both the samples. So for the intervention group also, the diets became more diversified during the second year of the pandemic, though the intensity of diversification was lower compared to the control groups. To summarize the key results of this model, we see that the affected households had a relatively more concentrated diet than the unaffected households, or the less affected ones. We also witnessed higher shifts to a more concentrated diet in rural households compared to the urban. The removal of restrictions during the second year of the pandemic impacted the dietary diversity of the intervention group in a favorable manner, and their diets became more diversified, though the intensity of diversification was lower compared to the control groups. In sum, an income shock of any magnitude proves to alter the dietary patterns of households both in rural and urban India, though the impact has been more severe in rural India compared to the urban, and during the first year of the pandemic compared to the second. Thus, our results reveal negative impact of the pandemic-induced income shock on food diversity in India. So to conclude today's discussion, our findings indicate a spurt in food expenditure shares and staple expenditure shares during the lockdowns, with some reversal once the lockdown was lifted, but that was not to the pre-pandemic levels. So this structural shift in the consumption basket of household as a result of income and unemployment shocks, compounded by supply restrictions, is witnessed among households across the income distribution and more among minorities and the deprived. If food expenditure share may be treated as a crucial measure of standard of living, as has been done in the existing literature, and share of staples as an indicator of dietary diversity, the trends are alarming. High food shares may imply substitution of food for essential items such as education and health. The greater responsiveness of food expenditure shares and staples expenditure shares after the outbreak of COVID-19 in India raise concerns about the household's resilience to such unprecedented shocks. Therefore, what is important is creation and effective functioning of supply chains as well as safety nets to overcome supply, price, income shocks. So this may be done through larger allocation to Manrega to reduce the income shock and stabilize the food consumption, and also to generate stable sources of employment. Also, we see that a lower dietary diversity or a reduction in dietary diversity during the situations of macro shocks, such as the pandemic, may unravel a story of limited access and instability of food security among the lower segments of the society. So the regional balances should be checked for by taking relevant policy measures like better integration of rural markets. And we all know that markets play an important role in determining diets, particularly in rural areas, through both demand and supply side effects. We also observe a higher dietary diversity and lower fluctuation in the same during the pandemic in the female-headed households. So as Nidhi also pointed out, this is a very significant result that throws light on the importance of women empowerment. As growing affluence, lifestyle changes, and urbanization are irreversible, so the focus must shift to provision of public goods, that is, for example, rural infrastructure, to facilitate the participation of small holders in high value chains, regulation of food safety standards, nutritional labeling, which is again very important, and especially for women. So in conclusion, a balanced and a nutritious diet is a must for a strong immune system to fight any form of infection, and is also of utmost importance for recoveries post the horrific COVID-19 infection. We believe and we hope that the findings from the study are expected to help policymakers formulate suitable policies to improve food quality, nutritional outcomes, not only in India, but other developing countries as well. I, on behalf of my research collaborators, Nidhi and Raghav, thank the organization for giving us an opportunity to present our work. I also thank Dr. Chandana for agreeing to be a discussant of our presentation. Special thanks to Preetha and the CMI team for the immediate responses rather to our queries about the data. Thanking the audience for their time. We look forward to interesting insights that will inform our ongoing and future research from Dr. Chandana. Thank you.
Thank you, Aashi, and thank you, Nidhi, for a wonderfully presented presentation. So that's the best way I can put it. It was a very well organized presentation, and it was very well presented. So you did a lot of work, and that required a very patient presentation. So compliments on that. But I think we will quickly get on to hearing Chandana on her comments on this wonderful book. You're on mute, Chandana. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you. And Nidhi and Aashi, I commend you for the excellent presentation. I just
Thank you, ma'am.
Mahesh, what he just said, I totally agree with that. And I just quickly like to thank the organizers and CMI, of course, for giving me this opportunity, to contribute to this discussion, because this is a topic which is very close to my heart, actually. Food security is my specialization. And I think the research community is waiting for an analysis like this. So this is very timely. So I will be brief in my comments. You have presented two papers. First, I'll focus on the published paper and to provide a summary just for the audience, a recap basically. So what you have done in this paper is examine the effect of pandemic on how it impacted the food expenditure pattern, I mean, share of food expenditure, the shift in angel curve, was there any effect at all, or you did find an effect, and share of food expenditure actually increased, right? You used 8 weights of CMIE, and the comparison was pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, and once the lockdown was lifted, like after the second wave. So these are the periods considered, right? And the modeling strategy is to stage least square instrumental variable estimator. The second paper is an extension of this published paper, and there you look into the effect of pandemic on dietary diversity, changes in food composition, and broadly the result is that pandemic actually reduced dietary diversity, and the effect was more severe in rural areas, right? And in addition to QSLS, you also used difference in effects approach. So I will basically categorize my comments into what to say. A part of it is just conceptual, intuitive understanding of few things, and secondly, some technical comments. So coming to the conceptual part, my main comment is that, it's, I'll just mention a few key points. Food security. So I just have a little concern in making an inference on food security as such. So I'll talk about the published paper first, because food expenditure, share of food expenditure is definitely a widely used indicator of access to food, but it's a proxy indicator. And the recent literature, has developed so much that now we have direct indicators of food security. I know you have to be, you are restricted to what CMIE offers. So that is not my main comment is that the problem with looking into food expenditure might be that the changes that you observe, that is the shapes, it might have got something to do with nutrition transition, which you have mentioned in your other paper. And these changes already started. They set in much before the pandemic. So, it's hard to entangle, like the effects that you see, are they really caused by the pandemic, or they were already there? That is pre-trend. And like there are some papers on top of my head, I can recall, maybe EPW had excellent articles at some point of time around 2004-5. I can't recall one by Pranab Sen. Maybe I'll share the references later. I'll share it with you. But the broad idea is how to entangle. That is a conceptual issue which I'm seeing here. And this actually, I can transfer it to your other paper also, similar problem. That is the changes that you notice. How do we establish that these are pandemic induced? Secondly, income. So that is, your both papers, the basic premise is that income induced shocks. Now, there is, this literature is recent because pandemic is a recent event, but there are the literature, some of them are already debating whether income declined at all. It did decline, but then it recovered. So the change is shortly. So when we say income induced shock, inequality or absolute income, there was an increase in inequality, there was a decline in income, but then it recovered quite quickly. So again, there are some papers. I'll share the references later, but one of them is based on CMIE. I can recall that clearly, okay? So you may consider just how to basically structure your argument in that context. Okay, I have made notes, so I may have to occasionally look at my notes just to see what are the other points. So the third, conceptually, okay, mechanism. Now you have mentioned, so because I'm focusing on the published paper now, it's more clear in your extension, but the mechanism linking pandemic to all these effects on the outcome, that is shift in food expenditure or dietary diversity is clearer actually. So that needs to be elaborated, I think. The first paper, okay, now I'm focusing on the published one. Because what are the channels? Like there are many, I would say, conflicting influences of pandemic on food related behavior. You did mention these points actually, more in the context of the second paper, that is, say, people preferring food with longer shelf lives, okay, or to avoid health risks, you go for food which is packaged properly, nicely packaged. Then there is this stress factor, emotional eating, pandemic, lockdown induced stress, comfort food. So you go for those high calorie, cheap, or sometimes expensive, but comfort food basically. And that is unhealthy behavior. But at the same time, there was an opposite effect, like going for more healthy food, home cooked food. So it worked in different directions. And basically what you will probably have to do is to look into the expenditure pattern of different categories of food to get a better idea on that. Yeah, that's the third like conceptual issue which came to my mind. All right, now coming to the technical bit, methodological issues. Now, with the published paper, I'm a bit confused. So in the published version regarding data, you mentioned pooled cross-section, but it is actually panel data, right? Because there I got a little bit confused, because panel would be that you are observing the same households over time. But I understand there may be attrition, households drop, and that basically reduces the sample size. You don't get all those households with which you started, it reduces it. But when you have panel data, that is, you are observing the same households. So you can exploit it, I mean, in so many ways. So I was thinking for robustness, you did use instrumental variable. That's fine, excellent, that approach. I like it very much. But I think you can do a robustness check. You go for fixed effect estimation because you have panel data. You can get rid of those time invariant unobserved factors, which is one of the main advantages of panel data. That is something which struck me. And yeah, also, this gives you an opportunity, but that is, of course, when more waves are available. Can't do it right now, probably, but you will be able to observe how households are going, falling into, say, distress, food insecurity, whichever way you define it, and coming out of it when you have panel data, because you are observing the same households over time. And as you get more webs of data, longer panel, this is something, this is just for future research. So that is one key point. And yes, in this context, I think you use IV to SLS, that is fine. As I say, I like your approach, the way you have thought about the instrument, that is nice. But I think you just have to explain a bit more. Why is it endogenous? COVID-19, the indicator, that explanation is missing. So endogeneity might originate from, yes, augmented variable bias, reverse causality, unobserved, preferences, unobserved heterogeneity, as we say technically, or measurement error. I think in this case, probably measurement error, COVID-19 number will be relevant, unobserved references might be relevant, like for example, say health awareness, just as an example. It might influence both your outcome variable, which is share of food expenditure, because that will affect the food behavior, health awareness, level of awareness. And it also affects your, whether how susceptible you are to infection. You are, if you are aware, you are going to wear masks, you are going to take care, basically. So that is just as an example. So broadly, my comment is that we probably need to talk about it in a clear and structured manner. What is the source of indigeneity in your context? And accordingly, that basically drives your methodology, because the other problem that might crop up here is if you have measurement error in the planetary variable, that's an error in variable problem, and errors in variable problem, which is also very complicated. You use the same technique eventually, instrumental variable is fine, but just the mechanisms, just to link, give the intuitive context. Okay. What else did I have? So data, okay. Now I'll just talk about the variables quickly. Your key explanatory variable, number of infections, right? Total number, cumulative. So here my only comment is, this is fine, but my only comment is probably you should do a robustness check, because you can use other indicators like Center for Disease Control, they recommended new cases, the number of new cases, say per 100,000 population, or the number of new hospitalizations, which captures the severity. So this is just robustness. Okay? What you have done is perfectly okay. It's just additional analysis. And about the instrument, my only, it's just a curiosity, what is the degree of variability? How much variation you have in the data? That's just a, I was thinking, like, because you don't have much time, right? Since the first infection was spotted, and then the time that you mentioned, the 2 months, probably, right? So how much variation you will have in the data? That's just a thought, not very serious concern. MPC. Okay, here I have an important comment. MPC. So in this literature, estimating enzyme curve, MPC, the literature argues that this is endogenous, and because it expenditure and share of expenditure in a particular category may be jointly determined, or there could be again unobserved preference which can affect MPC. So technically, probably you should treat this as endogenous, and the literature has used instrumental variable technique. Again, they have, I think, commonly used, some of the instruments are income squared and income, to address the endogeneity. So that occurred to me that this is something we should address. And in this context, I have another comment, which is, you have used per capita measure. Why not use equivalized scale? Because this is a developing country context, and you mentioned welfare, and actually you have discussed it quite nicely, the importance of household size, composition. The natural extension is, think about equivalized scale. So again, you could just do it as robustness check, see how the results differ, okay? And so now, following from that, control variables, household size, I think you can try adding household size square or log of household size, because you did mention that there could be an economy of, I mean, there is, the literature talks about economy of scale, large households, so to capture that. And the other, among your control variables, the other one is, I was thinking about farming versus non-farm. So I was just thinking that if you are missing some information here, because pandemic really did, I mean, one section of the population which was hard hit by the pandemic, the workers in the informal urban wage earners. So this classification, with this classification, you might be missing, and if you club all of it into non-farm, probably you are missing some. This is a group which there might be some value in investigating them separately. So just think about regrouping. Again, this can be a robust system. Maybe you won't get anything meaningful, but it's worth trying. And what else did I have here? Yeah, so broadly, these are my comments. And coming to the dietary diversity paper, now, most of my comments apply, many of my comments apply to the extension, but in fact, I actually like the extension more than the published one, because the impact on food composition, dietary diversity, I mean, we can hypothesize that there definitely, I mean, I think we can formulate a clearer hypothesis in the context of dietary diversity, even though I would still maintain my main argument that nutrition transition has already been impacting and making changes in food composition, etc. But still, this is a better way. If you talk about food security, maybe this is a better way of, better indicator actually. And besides, it also captures a very, very important food security outcome, which is micronutrients. Because calorie, we have come a long way from calorie. The focus is more on micronutrients. And okay, so dietary diversity is very, very relevant in that context. And about the methodology, now 2SLS is fine. I already discussed some points, but with DID again, my main concern is that the parallel trend assumption, how do you justify it? You need a solid justification, because as I said, income induced shocks, okay, income decline or changes in income inequality, there might have been a pre-trend even before the pandemic. And then again, there was this recovery. So we are still not very clear or sure about what is going on. I think it would be better when you get a longer panel. It's probably too early. And the other issue is same again, like how do you establish, or how do you entangle the effect of pandemic from these other trends like nutrition transition? How do you say that these changes are cause and effect? Because parallel trend would require that kind of interpretation or justification that it is the pandemic which is actually making these changes, nothing else, which is very hard to establish at this point of time. Maybe you can get a longer panel that will come out more clearly. Okay, so broadly, these are my comments, but I I said before, this is an excellent paper, and just keep working on it, and you're doing great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maitra, for a good long list of all observations on the paper presented by Nidhi and Aashi, and I'm sure they will make good use of it. Would you like to respond to any of the comments made by Professor Maitra now, Nidhi?
Yeah, just very quickly, thank you so much. We look forward to receiving your notes. and have made note of a few of them, but it'll help if you can share all of them. And one thing that we share with you is we also like the second paper better than the first. So because when you do it and then okay, this is where
Yeah.
wise. The last comment that you made, the parallel trend assumption, actually we used a much longer panel. We did not restrict it to 8 waves. We extended it to almost 14 waves, I think. But I think you're
Yeah.
right. The CMI data is available from 2014 onwards. And maybe we can actually look at testing the parallel trend assumption, not just between 2018 and 19, but maybe over a longer period prior to the pandemic. And that will help us in the robustness check. On your first comment where you're talking about food expenditure shares as being, one, but not a very, I'm not going to say, but a very exhaustive indicator of food security, which is why we moved to the second paper. But here, I would also like to answer the one question from the audience in terms of extension. Right now we don't have prices. And this is maybe an indication towards Mahesh and Preetha also. So we don't have prices at the village level or at the FSU level. And we are using state level prices to just, use as deflators rather. But having prices, a granular price level data will help us convert these expenditures into consumption and eventually into nutrition. So, we can actually, if we have consumption and not just expenditures, then converting them into nutrient intake like calories, proteins, and fats will probably help
Yes.
us use a similar specification. And then we look
Yes.
at what has been the impact of the pandemic on nutrition and not just food expenditure.
Exactly.
We've
Yeah.
done previously with the NSO data,
Yeah.
but maybe we have to innovatively think of a way, how do we convert these expenditures
Yes.
into expenditures into consumption? And I guess that will be a very enriching insight that
Yeah.
will be
That will be an excellent extension.
Yeah.
Definitely. And he also provides some information on health indicators, like if you can really look into some health outcomes. Probably I can't recall, I haven't used it, but I have a big idea.
I think what they have right now is self-reported health status, but not nutrient per se. But
yeah, but you can still use it. As a self-reported is fine. Many good surveys these days report.
But thank you so much for all these comments, and we look forward to incorporating most of them, and especially the robustness checks that you've talked about. So we've used some of them. We've experimented with COVID-19 deaths. We've experimented with severity ratios, which is comparing deaths to pre-pandemic. We've done new cases, new deaths. So, and we get similar results. So we just report the cumulative cases at the end of this month. But other suggestions are extremely helpful, and we will take them into account in our ongoing research.
Okay, so thank you for the suggestion, Nidhi, that we should try and incorporate prices data at the local level. I will keep this in mind, can't promise anything, but certainly we will. An ask is always a valuable ask. So we will keep this in mind for sure. You're right, we do have data on health. There is self-reported health, which is, are you healthy or not? Are you hospitalized? Are you on medication or not? But we also have household level expenditure on health. So how much does the household spend on medicines or consulting or hospitalization and so on and so forth? There are half a dozen indicators over there. And we are, by the way, expanding the scope of questions on health as well. So health is a subject of particular interest to us, and we will be doing more on it. Lastly, you did make a mention in your paper and during your presentation as well, that the CMI adequately captures consumption of self-produced goods. Well, we do, but you have made a note which makes me think that I should go back and check whether we are missing anything on the field. So while in principle, in theory, in actual enumerations, that indication is there. The indicator is included. But whether we are missing something in the field and practice, I will go and do a stress test on that. Okay, we have run out of time, but this has been a wonderful presentation. Nidhi and Aashi, thank you so much for so patiently presenting such a wonderful paper. I learned a lot today, and it makes me go back and read your paper again after your presentation. It's so nice. And Professor Maitra, thank you so much for patiently giving such wonderful observations to them. Your pointers to them in your notes will be of great help to them, and we will transcribe them for the rest of the world as well. Okay, hope to see you all again in future presentations. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining in this show today. We'll sign off now with a big thank you to the authors and the discussants.
Thank you.